outlines. We get a couple outlines in here, please. Anybody else? I saw Mr. Ken needs one. No, there's just one. First Chronicles. I need one up here for Ken Royster, please. Good morning, Amelia. How's things? All right. Amelia Tao has survived so far. She's here with us today. Good to see her. All right, First Chronicles. This, as was told to me not long ago, this is a tough one. The book of First Chronicles has a lot of, the first 9 chapters essentially, genealogies tracing various families of course, starting with Adam. I mean, that's the first name in the text, and then tracing through the families of Israel and the kings of Judah, and then broken down from there. For instance, chapter 6, the family of Levi, and then for instance, in chapter 6 there, you've got the different responsibilities of the Levites under the law of Moses. And then you go through the tribes of Israel, the individuals and their families. So I guess I would say those first 9 chapters are a bit challenging. That's the word I'll use to read through. Of course, if you're an Israelite, and you are part of if you have part in the land inheritance, then this stuff's important. This stuff matters. So you can trace your family. And if you're a Levite, it matters. So, service in the priesthood and such. But what's interesting is, for us, this may be a section that we are tempted just to kind of glaze over and skip. But you look at the other genealogies in the Bible, whether Genesis 5 or Genesis chapter 10, Matthew chapter 1, Luke chapter 3, these various accounts of families, it's good to see this because you have I guess you'd say, each of those accounts verifies the other. And looking at the history of creation, again, Chronicles starting with Adam and then the development of the Abrahamic promises through his children, Isaac, and then Jacob, and then the 12 tribes, and again, all of that stuff. So that's your first 9 chapters, and I really don't have a whole lot to say about that, other than what's in the text. Now, 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 1 is significant. So all Israel were reckoned by genealogies, and behold, they were written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah, who were carried away to Babylon for their transgression. So there's even another point in history that I would say further verifies the other accounts, again, of the genealogies, and then, of course, the books of Samuel and Kings. And then as you go through particularly 2 Chronicles and dealing with the nation of Judah, all of that is verified. And I think I mentioned this last week, but originally Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles were one book. But they were, and I'm not sure when, I didn't look this up, but they were divided into 6 books, obviously, for ease of read and things like that, but just an interesting note there. So what you have in your outline here, we'll look at the bottom section first. Well, let's look at the first couple lines, I guess. So this book, 1 Chronicles, is a condensed version of the genealogies and Israelite history. And again, genealogies from Adam and then Israelite history all the way up to the death of David. Samuel and Kings, the books of Samuel and Kings trace the history of the united kingdom of Israel, as well as both sides of the divided kingdom. So, down at the bottom, I have it here for you, the supplement, that Chronicles is a supplemental, I shouldn't say it that way. It's not a supplemental document. It's a document that does supplement things that we have recorded in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then, in fact, even on into 1 Kings. And so I've got all the parallels for you there. And they're actually quite a bit more detailed than that, but you might do that on your own sometime. I didn't want to give it all away for you, but I've given you a very general parallel of what goes on in 1 Chronicles and how that's paralleled in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then just the first couple of chapters of 1 Kings. It's interesting to note that, and it's valuable to know that, because in some of the accounts, in one part or in the other part, you get more details, and so you can compile those and come to a better understanding. So what I've done in my Bible is I've written out throughout every, well, just for instance, look at 1 Chronicles chapter 11, and really beginning in verse 15. I've got, so like looking at your outline here, 2 Samuel 23, 13 to 24, I've actually taken through my Bible and written down the actual verses, by the actual verses, what verse it's talking. I didn't do it just by chapter sections. I went verse by verse through my Bible and wrote down, okay, this verse is paralleled with this verse. And so I have quite a bit of marking in my Bible, like here in verse 17. Well, that's from 2 Samuel 23, 13. And then verse 20 is 2 Samuel 23, 18. And verse 22 is 2 Samuel 23 and verse 20. So I went all the way through 1st and 2nd Chronicles and did that where the accounts parallel, or, well, not just parallel, but also perhaps there's more detail given in Chronicles or more detail given in Samuel and Kings, because they supplement one another, they complement one another. Maybe that's the better way to put it. They complement one another. So you get through those genealogies in the first 9 chapters, and then you get to chapter 10, and you're thrown into the scene of the Philistine battle against the Israelites when Saul and his sons are killed. And so it kind of jumps, you might say, from one topic to another rather abruptly. But so 1 Chronicles chapter 10 starts in 1 Samuel chapter 31. Again, there's that parallel account. So the Philistines followed hard after Saul and after his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. And so from there, you keep reading, and we move into the reign of David as king. Any questions or comments on any of that so far? One of the interesting things about 1 Chronicles in particular is the record, or the recording of the establishment, if you will, of David as king of Israel, and all the appointments that he made in his administration. Chronicles all of that. Chronicles all of that, if that makes sense. And so that's kind of interesting, too, to note the breadth of this administration. It wasn't just David as king. There's a lot of people serving under him. And again, this is supplemental to the other accounts that we have. There's something. Okay, so here's something. So, look at 1 Chronicles chapter 12. Beginning in 1 Chronicles 12, beginning in verse 23, you have some of David's administrations, people that he appoints to be over various things. And so I've got one thing that's marked in my Bible here in verse 32. It says, of the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do, the heads of them were 200, and all their brethren were at their commandment. And then Zebulun, as much as went forth to battle, expert in war with all the instruments of war. So again, this is kind of the alignment of the nation under David, but one of the things I've got underlined in there is in verse 32, men who had understandings of the time to know what Israel ought to do. And I just put in the margin of my Bible, we need that in the church. Men of understanding who know what needs to be done. Leadership, the pastoral work of the elders, men who have understanding of the times and know what needs to be done at the time. You know, a lot of decisions, I would say, that the elders make and things that they have to talk about many times, I would say many more times than like doctrinal issues that come up, are issues of something like this, issues of judgment. Perhaps not things that are black and white laid out in Scripture as right and wrong, but we have this situation that's arisen. Now, how do we handle this? What's the best way to approach this? Or maybe we can find somebody in the congregation to help us in this work. And again, men of understanding who know the times, who understand what needs to be done in the time. And man, it's like within the last few years, our world has sped up so much, and maybe it's because of our 24/7 access to news and to social media. We see so much, we hear so much. The world today, and over the last several years I would say, especially since the dawn of social media, we're in a different world. It's just, we live in a totally different world. And I would say those of you who are older than I, perhaps you see it more than I do. Because it was, you know, the world has changed a lot in the last 42 years, but I would say it's changed a lot more over the last 80 years, or 70 years even. And it's changed so fast, especially in the last couple of years. I don't really know how to state it properly, but we need men who had understanding of the times, who knows what the church ought to do. And of course, that's always governed by Scripture first. But that's what we need. Men who are aware of what's going on in the world, but how we as the church respond to that. And things that we should be doing, or perhaps change. And again, that not in the sense that when, you know, a lot of times when we use that word change in the church, our mind automatically gets suspicious and we think of, oh, he's gone liberal. That's a liberal congregation. That's not what I'm talking about, but there are times when perhaps a change in approach to something may be called for. Perhaps handle something differently than has been handled in the past. And again, men who understand the times and know what the church ought to do, that need never goes away. You know, so the book of Proverbs, for instance, tells us where there is no vision, the people die. Where there's no forethought, the people die. You know, I would say it's easy to maintain. You know, it's easy to play, as it's been said, to play church, you know. Hey, we're meeting budget, and most everybody's here, so we're good. Anybody can do that. But that's not what we're called to do. We're not called to pay the bills as the church. And what I mean by that is run this as it's a business. Now, we need to pay the bills. Yes, that's not, you understand what I'm saying there, but when we reduce the work of the church to keeping the lights on and keeping the pews filled, we're missing a lot. And again, that's not to negate the necessity of any of that, of keeping the lights on or keeping the pews filled. But if that's all our perspective is, then then we're missing out on what we are, big time. One of the works of the church is, okay, so for instance, let's talk about this for a minute. So how do we classify, I'll ask you guys, since I'm doing all the talking so far, how do we classify the work of the church typically? What are the works of the church we talk about a lot of times? Typically there's three of them. What are they? Evangelism, benevolence. This third one's a little more, I would say we don't think of it as much, but it's just as important as the first two. Edification. You know, so keeping the saved saved. That's we want to save the lost, but you know, we also need to we also have the responsibility to keep the saved saved. Now, we also understand that's an individual responsibility. I can't save you, and you can't save me, but we can certainly edify one another. You know, you've got passages like Hebrews 10:24. Let us consider one another to provoke one another unto love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. So we get that mutual edification, building each other up, but I can't save you. I can encourage you. You can encourage me. We can rebuke each other if that need comes about. But so evangelism, benevolence, and edification. That's more than keeping the lights on and having your seat filled on a Sunday morning. If our goal is just that, then... So here's a question. Let's think about it this way. I heard somebody pose, and I never really thought about it like this before, but I heard this just a couple of years ago, and it made me really think about what I do personally. So if this congregation, if we were to just shut the doors, we're done. Okay? It's no more. Who would be affected most by that? Would it be us, or would it be the community around us? Let me re-ask the question. Who would be affected more? Us or the community around us? It would be us. Now, perhaps that speaks to what we're not doing in the community. Benevolence. Evangelism. Okay? Keeping the saved saved, we're good at that. I mean, we're here and we shake hands. I saw you guys know what the Babylonian bee is, don't you? It's a satire. I love it. Man, they hit things so accurately. But so the Babylon bee did a survey, and it said something like 98% of church folks are all doing good. Because, you know, we walk in the door, how you doing? Oh, I'm good. And it's a very superficial, shallow, it's just what we do, you know. And it's not that we're not concerned and that we don't care. It's just, that's what we want to get to our seat before anybody takes it. And we don't want to get in any uncomfortable conversations. And keeping the saved, we've got that, okay? We're here and we communicate with each other, and we, throughout the week we talk and things like that. But if this congregation were to shut down, would the community even miss us? Something to think about. And perhaps there's a reflection in the answer to that question on what we are or are not doing in this community. So, something to think about. Any questions or comments on on 1 Chronicles 12:32? Because that's kind of where that discussion started. Yeah. It bothered everybody. That was, and that's maybe that's one thing I was thinking about in talking about how much the world has changed lately, because it has so much and so quickly and completely unexpectedly, and not just small changes, but radical changes in our daily lives. And it affected everybody. There's no question about that. And perhaps we've gotten stronger through it, I hope. And perhaps we've done things, and what we always say, hindsight's 20/20. Perhaps we'll never have to go there again. Yeah. We appreciate it more. I would hope so. All right. Anything else before we move on from that? That phrase right there in 1 Chronicles 12:32 to me is aimed right at the leadership of the church. Men who had understanding of the times and who knows what the church ought to do. And that's always based in Scripture, obviously. But like I said, most of the time, now there are times when this is not the case, but most of the time, the decisions that our elders have to make are matters of judgment. And,
Growing up in the church,
ma'am?
I think growing up in the church, it's always been in smaller communities where I've grown up. People recognize that the church, we stand for the truth.
Mm.
We're going to follow the New Testament teachings on worship, that kind of thing. People know that in the
Sure.
community. But when you were talking about benevolence, I think that's where we get hurt. Because my personal experience, we have a tendency to be in our own bubble,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't reach out in community like we should.
Yeah.
And then
Well, we're comfortable.
right,
We're comfortable in our own bubble.
They see us as benevolent.
Yeah.
They see us as cold.
So what Jamie's saying is I'm with you 100%. The community knows, okay, the Church of Christ, well, they don't use instruments, and they teach you have to be, the community knows that, those general, what I would call surface concepts that the church stands for, because that's what the Bible teaches. But so there are groups, even within the church, who say that once the money hits the plate, it can't be used outside. It's only for the church. And, that's a whole other subject. But that, frankly, churches that aren't what we refer to as anti, behave as if they were. Or we'll do this. And there's nothing wrong with this. But this, I think we try to justify our local inaction by what we do somewhere else. Well, we send money to the children's home. We're doing our work, are we? That's good, okay? That's not to denigrate in any way that work. Or we send our money we support what? The guy in India. Jim Waldron. Man, I couldn't. Yeah, Jim Waldron and the Pacific Islands Bible College and the Memphis School of Preaching. And we do that. We send our money miles and miles away, halfway around the world for evangelism. And that's like, well, we're doing our job. Well, we're doing part of it. But that's kind of what I was saying. Well, if this church were to shut down, Jim Waldron would miss that money. And Stacy would miss that money, and the children's home would miss. And what about the people right around our building?
And we don't need to boast about it, of course. But
No.
people around here don't know what we do, that we do those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like I have friends that are belong to other groups, And I'm with Jamie on this. Their groups do a lot of benevolent work. And something else too. During the pandemic, they didn't stop. They kept doing their, how we had our team meetings and stuff. They were getting together as groups, small groups, doing good and doing a lot of good things. And it really bothered me because I heard them talk about it. We weren't even having services at the time.
Yeah.
They were still doing their group work. I just think we really need to make sure we're always a good example and a light.
Yeah. Well,
We need to focus on benevolence, and that's important,
yeah. And that's kind of the point of, if we shut the doors, would we be missed? And again, keeping the saved saved, that is part of what we do. But that's part of what we do. That's not the totality of the work of the church. And so I'm thankful that we have, first, I'm thankful that we have elders. Secondly, I'm thankful that we have wise elders here who have had to navigate some terribly challenging and difficult times. And
And we need to be thankful we have it so easy. These New Testament Christians, I mean, they literally had to fear for their physical life all the time
yeah.
to spread the word. And they endured, Sometimes we just probably get lax because it is so easy.
Well, and I think that's a good way. It's not, and here's the thing, it's not that we're, and when I'm saying we're and we, I'm not talking about necessarily us, right? I'm talking about the church in general, okay? I'm using generic terms in that. I want you to understand that too. But we get, as we say with people, we get stuck in a rut sometimes as the church, and that can be dangerous too. There's a lot to be done.
I believe that we were doing more than what the denominations know.
Sure. And so kind of what Jamie was saying, people,
They were judging.
there are ideas that people have of the church, which is good. Those things, that they need to know what the Bible teaches on various subjects. But are we ever, here's where I want to go with this, I guess, and I really didn't intend to go where we've gone already, so we should never be satisfied with where we are congregationally, and frankly, individually either. We can all, myself included, do better at everything as a Christian, whether our worship or what we do in the community or as at home as a spouse or a parent. We can all always improve and do better, and so we can't stagnate. Maybe that's a good word. We can't get in the rut of complacency. I think that's maybe a good way to put it. I don't know. I've not.
Or even thank you.
Yeah.
That's where the hurt comes in.
Yeah. Absolutely. The way we conduct ourselves in the world. So let's think about door knocking for just a minute. Cold knock on a stranger's door. More than likely, that's not going to work too often. Now, it does. There's no question about that. It does work at times. But you're going to reach people who know you and trust you quicker than you'll reach somebody you've never met before. They don't know who you are or what your motives are. Okay, why is this guy? How much money do they want? I mean, you know how you think when somebody comes up to your door, don't you? What do they want?
Don't want them to think of us as the stuff they've been.
Well, hopefully we're conducting ourselves in such a way that they think of us as Christians. Hopefully. And again, individually and congregationally. And so, just some thoughts I had on 1 Chronicles 12:32. All right. Moving along here. I love this one. Turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 15. Now this is an interesting comment, I think, on the live stream. If the church closed in the community, the effect may not be apparent to those around you, but false teachings would spread and prosper. So, one thing that, man, that's a legitimate point right there. I guess I hadn't thought about it from that particular perspective, but, in any community you go to, you've got any number of different religious groups that teach different things, and you understand all that stuff. And so like what we do here, Fulton County Gospel News, and now the local Fulton County Gospel News, that's a way for us to get the word out. So we send out, I think it's 1,526 local papers, and so far, we've only gotten one complaint. I called the post office and I said, what do we do about this? They said, well, just give us the address and we'll take care of it. But that's a method. Do something. That's the thing. Since I've been here, there's a guy, I tell you what, he's the guy who, he made, I think, Steve, I think you had a tape of when this building was, whatever he did, took it from tape and put it on digital format, put it on CD, and so he runs this social media site about Northeast Arkansas Churches of Christ. And one of the things that he does on that page is he talks about works in different areas, particularly, you can't get any farther north, but more east than we are in Arkansas. And he talks about things that churches, gospel meetings and lectureships and things like that. But I'll tell you another thing he did. Well, it's Josh DeMint at Pyburn Street. He shares when churches close their doors. And I think you'd be shocked at how many times he shares such and such Church of Christ has closed their doors. And it's been kind of eye-opening to me to see how often that happens. How does a church get to that point where you shut your doors? Now, maybe the community was on a back road somewhere and the state came through and they built a bypass around the road and that community just died. It's a little farming community or something like that. We understand that kind of stuff, but in a town or in a city, how does a church die? What gets a congregation to a point where there are so few people that you just have to close down and the 3 or 4 of you that are there have to find another congregation to attend? Maybe there's something that churches aren't doing. Employment, sure. Yeah, there's no question about that. Just like the little scenario. Well, I'll tell you what, the Light. Light, Arkansas. Y'all ever driven through Light? Well, it didn't take long, did it? They shut their doors a couple of years. There's nobody there. And, that is, that's a thing. There are places like that where churches close because, there's no work. And so there may be a few houses in town, but the church closes down. And perhaps, I certainly don't know, but perhaps Light had knocked on every door. And we know that's a reality. You can knock on every door in a community and not get one response. Yeah. But how long, I guess one thing I'm thinking of is how long has a church been in decline without doing anything in the community, and they wonder why they're in decline? And we're not exempt from that. It's a reality, and we have to keep going in whatever way we can to keep on reaching out and spreading the gospel to those around us. There's never a time to stop. So a lot of these little and it was like this in West Tennessee, kind of like what Brother Pace mentioned. Back in the early 1900s, back in the horse and buggy days, as they call them, there were congregations set up every 2 or 3 miles all over this, and I preached there for about 4.5 years, and sometime after Gail and I got married, where you didn't get in a car and drive 20 minutes. You got on a horse, or you walked to the church building, and now in the 20th and 21st century, that need is no more. People will drive 30 minutes to go to a congregation, and that's not an inconvenience anymore. And in years gone by, that would have taken hours to get where you were going to church. And so there are things like that too that affect a local congregation. But we can never become complacent to the point where we're stagnating and dying, and we're sitting here doing nothing and wondering, why are we stagnating and dying? So, what did that have to do with 1 Chronicles, everybody? We need leadership who know the signs of the times and who knows what the church ought to do. So Chronicles is a very interesting book. There's a lot of history in there. Chapters 22 through 27 cover David's preparations and organization of the temple and its services, and you learn a lot right there. And then chapters 28 and 29 cover the transition from David to Solomon. So, all right, well, we got a bit, I would say, off topic from Chronicles, but I think it's good to have those discussions.